All right, we got 5 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get rolling. We'll do our best to wrap up chapters 10 through 12 tonight. Not quite sure we'll make it, but hopefully we can. So we'll kind of continue what we were talking about on Wednesday and move on through this lesson. So we'll be, if you're looking at the sheets you have, it'd be lessons 20 and 21 that we're going to be kind of ripping through. So Bart's going to lead us in a word of prayer before we start. So just to kind of briefly reset the stage, I don't want to go through too much of what we've already covered because we've got a lot to cover. But Daniel said in chapter 10, verse 1, and again, 10, 11, 12 is one unit, even though it's broken up into chapters. He said in verse 1 that he had a vision that he understood, and we can kind of assume that he understood it to some degree, but not completely, because the angel comes to give him the full interpretation. Most of the rest of chapter 10 is just not just, but it's the interaction with him and the angel. And then we got into the beginning of 11, which is the interpretation of the vision that he'd had. So we don't really get to see the vision, but we're talking about the interpretation. We'd read the first few verses. I don't know the best way to go through all this, so what we're going to do is I'm going to go through some little related what's now history. It wasn't history at the time, it was future. I'm going to go through that, and then we'll go back and read the verse, because I think when you read the verses, it's really confusing as you read through chapter 11, extremely confusing. And so what we'll do here is kind of go backwards. We'll look at what happened and then read the verse, and you can see how that fits together. So again, the purpose here is not for you to remember all this. I don't think that's necessary, but just to show this prophecy that was given fits precisely with the future that occurred at that point, what is now history for Daniel's people. And again, we talked about this on Wednesday night. He was told in 10:14 that this pertained to his people and what would happen to them in the latter days. And then at the very end of the vision, the angel said, when will all this come to pass? And it said it will be completed when the power of the holy people is shattered. That's in 12:7. So that gives us some context for what this is all about. And that really helps us, I think, to understand the purpose of the vision and what it's all about. So we kind of got into 3 and 4, a little bit of chapter 11. So I'm going to start there. I'm going to read a little history, and then we'll go back and read the verses quickly. So Alexander the Great was the son of Philip of Macedon. We've talked about that before. Alexander ruled Greece starting in 334 BC at the age of 22. He conquered Persia, Palestine, Egypt, and on into India in very rapid succession, and then died at the age of 33. And we looked at this map on Wednesday night that's the route he took. He had sons by 2 different women. One was his wife and another woman. They were killed over the next few years. And ultimately, after several internal battles and negotiations, the kingdom was divided up into 4 different kingdoms. And I think I showed you this map. Depending on what year you look at, you're going to get different maps because there were some different people in charge. So Seleucus, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus were the main ones. This was ruled temporarily, Antigonus, but that gives you the main ones. And then this territory became part of Seleucus later on. But this is all central to what is to come because it divided the Grecian power around what's right here. Israel. Yeah, Israel's right here. And so you end up with the Seleucus group, and Ptolemies are the primary ones. And it's just a back and forth ping pong between there. We'll look at that as we move into this lesson. So that's central to what is to come. It's interesting that I've read some different things, but it seems that Seleucus lost his territory temporarily after he had gained it. He became a general under Ptolemy, and then with Ptolemy's support, he went back and actually took that over and more. So I think that's when he took over this area. I'm not a historian, and depending on what you read, you get some different accounts of it, but that seems to be what happened. That was in 321 to 316 BC that he was a general under Ptolemy, and then he ended up going back and taking his territory. So let's look at chapter 11, verses 3 and 4. Is there somebody that wants to do the reading for these verses tonight, if you're a good reader and want to? Okay. That way you're not hearing my voice for everything, so This is the Bible voice back here. I'll be the historian, okay? So verses 3 and 4. Scrolling through it.
3 and 4. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with his great dominion and do as he will. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority which he received. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others beside him.
So you can see how that fits perfectly with what happened. So let's move into that. Verse 5 will be the next one. Before we read that, as king of the Egyptian territory, Ptolemy I Soter was his ruling name, is very powerful. He ruled from 323 to 283 BC. He conquered Cyprus and parts of Asia Minor. His general, as I mentioned, Seleucus, left and took control of the Syrian or northern area up through here. Seleucus, by taking Lysimachus' portion of the kingdom, became even more powerful, and he was supported by Ptolemy. So he went in 312 and took back his original territory and even more. He established Antioch and made that his capital. He died in 281 BC. And then what followed after that was a series of 6 different Grecian wars or Syrian wars. It's labeled differently depending on where you look, between the northern and southern portions of the Greek power. And so that's the history we're going to be going through up to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. And so this just gives you when each of the different wars were and the time frame of it. And again, in these ping-pong battles, who lies in the middle of it? Israel, Daniel's people, right? So that's what this pertains to. And so that's obviously going to impact them. You've got armies going back and forth through there. They're trying to control and conquer land, so they're going to be impacted by each one of those. And ultimately, this is leading up to the big events that are going to happen with Antiochus Epiphanes, and then eventually down the road, even the Roman destruction. So how does that relate back to 1014? It's your people in the latter days, right? So that's where this is all pointed. And so those boxes that I put on your sheet were just a brief summary of the history. So we're going to continue to rip through all that. So you want to read verse 5 for us now?
Yes. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger and shall rule, and his authority shall be as great as.
So again, that fits with what happened. All right, so we'll look at 6 next. This skips 35 years down the road. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, so that's the second king of the southern kingdom. So again, on this map, here's the Ptolemaic kingdom and then the Seleucid kingdom up here. So Ptolemy, the king of the south, has a daughter named Berenice, and in order to end the second Syrian war, so that's 260 to 253, in order to end that war, he arranged her marriage to Antiochus II Theos. So that's the current king of the northern province or Syrian province. In 250 BC, Antiochus divorced his wife Laodice in order to marry Berenice. So he's married to Laodice. He divorces her to marry Berenice from the south, and that kind of ends the second Syrian or Greek war. 4 years later, in 246 BC, he divorced Berenice and went back to his first wife, Laodice. Laodice then poisoned Antiochus, her husband, Berenice, and Berenice's baby. So that's what he got for reuniting. Laodice's son, so that's the son of the northern kingdom, Laodice's son, Seleucus II, is placed on the throne of the north. But because of the death of Berenice and her entourage from Egypt in 246, that ignites the third Syrian war. So that's kind of what's coming as we look down. That's also known as the Laodicean War because of her being the impetus for that. And that's between Seleucus and Ptolemy III. And again, Israel's between that. So let's read verse 6 with that history in mind.
After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north and make a treaty. But she shall not retain the strength of her own. And even his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her things, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in this time.
So again, that fits with what we know happened there. All right, so the next section we're going to look at is verses 7 through 9, and this is talking about this third Syrian war that was started because of Laodice poisoning Berenice and her son. So Berenice's brother, Ptolemy III, is on the southern throne now. Ptolemy III is the king of Egypt. He attacks the northern kingdom because of what had happened to his sister with Seleucus II on the throne, and he gains a lot of land from the northern kingdom. He then returned to Egypt and lived the rest of his life in peace without warring any more against the north. So it was kind of a revenge war, and then after that, they kind of lived in peace. However, the land that he had taken back from the northern kingdom was gradually lost back to them over the rest of his rule. Seleucus II from the north attacked Ptolemy unsuccessfully during that time and then returned home. And ultimately, Ptolemy from the southern kingdom, Ptolemy III, lived 3 years longer than Seleucus II. So let's read verses 7 through 9 now. Okay, and again, that fits precisely with what happened with history. And just a reminder, when it talks about Egypt, we think of Pharaoh and the old Egyptian kingdom. This is talking about the Greeks controlling Egypt, so the Ptolemaic kingdom when it talks about Egypt here. All right, so we'll look at verses 10 through 12 as the next section. So Seleucus II, on the king that we were just talking about from the north, Seleucus II is followed by his son Seleucus III Soter, who ruled from 225 to 223 BC. And he soon died by conspiracy. And then a second, so I'm going to write these down because this comes into play in a minute. So you've got Seleucus II, and he has Seleucus III Soter. And he was 2 years and then died by conspiracy. The next son is Antiochus III. The one that we refer to as Antiochus the Great. And this will come into play in a few minutes. So Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, takes the throne at the age of 18. The Fourth Syrian War then starts in 219 to 217 BC. Antiochus brought a large force against Egypt where Ptolemy IV, Philopator, is king. Antiochus was defeated by Ptolemy's general Scopas at Raphia in 217 BC, and that ends the Fourth Syrian War. Both of them had very large forces, but Antiochus lost 17,000 men compared to 2.2 thousand for Ptolemy. So 17,000 lost compared to 2.2 thousand. Despite a sound victory, Ptolemy settled with a peace agreement. He didn't try to expand his kingdom beyond its former borders, so he just basically ended it, had a peace agreement, and that was the end of it. So let's read verses 10 to 12 now with that history in mind. Okay. And then let's look at verses 13 to 14 is the next section. So in the south, Ptolemy IV Philopator died. His 5-year-old son Ptolemy IV Epiphanes becomes the king. Because there's a young king on the throne and not good support, there's a power struggle. The queen gets killed, and then multiple other people try to lead. There were multiple assassinations and a state of near anarchy throughout Egypt during that time frame. Antiochus III the Great, again from the northern kingdom, he sees this as an opportunity to strike. There's anarchy, there's nobody really controlling things, they're not unified in any way, so he sees it as an opportunity to strike against the southern kingdom. There's a phrase that we're going to see here that says, "Many shall stand up against the king of the south." There were many insurrections early in the reign of this young king, in large part due to one of the ministers, the one who had assassinated the queen. He was a cruel and a poor administrator, and so it caused a lot of insurrections among the people because of that. Much of that is apparently recorded on the Rosetta Stone. So 14 years after the previous war, in the Fifth Syrian War here, after that, 14 years later after that ended, Antiochus raises up an even greater force. The Ptolemies had been fairly kind in their rule to the Jews. They treated them fairly well, but despite that, some of the violent men of Israel sided with Antiochus, hoping to gain freedom. So because of that, because they basically rebelled against the southern kingdom and tried to aid Antiochus, Scopas, again the general for Ptolemy, Scopas was sent to take back control of Judea, and according to Josephus, he destroyed the Jewish nation, is how Josephus recorded it. And just as a side point, we'll see that this eventually brings the Jews much harm because it led to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, that we'll be talking about here in a few minutes, being able to rule them. So that's looking a little further down the road, not part of these verses we'll be reading. But Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, his forces came against Ptolemy IV Epiphanes of Egypt and defeated his general Scopas at Panium in 198 BC. So let's read verses, what was it? 13 and 14, is that where we're at? It's on my previous page. Yeah, 13 and 14.
For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude living in the plains, and after some weeks he shall come on with a great army and abundant supply. In those times the king shall rise against the kings of south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision they shall fail.
Okay. So after the defeat at Panium, Scopas and 10,000 men fled to Sidon, which is on the coast here of Israel. They fled to Sidon, which was a fortified city. Antiochus the Great set up a siege against it. There was an Egyptian army sent from the south to try to rescue him, but they were unable to. In 198 BC, Scopas surrendered due to hunger. After that, Antiochus also took several of the Ptolemaic cities along the coast, along through here, and ended up controlling all of Palestine, which had been under the southern kingdom's rule. So let's read verses 15 and 16 with that in mind.
For the king of the north shall come furrow eastward from the well-fortified city, and the forces which come south shall not stand or even set troops, for there shall be no strength in the land. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glory of his reign, and destruction will be his name.
So again, just as a side point, when you read these verses, it doesn't make any sense because, there's characters we don't understand, and it's really changing who's the north and who's the south. But when you tie it with history and read through it, it fits very well with it. So that's what we're trying to do here, and hopefully this is helping a little bit. All right, verse 17 is the next part we'll look at. So Antiochus III the Great sets up to invade Egypt. But Rome is growing in strength. They had just overthrown Philip IV of Macedon and Greece. So it concerned Antiochus that Rome would interfere. So he's thinking, he wants to do this, but he's concerned about their interference. So what he does is devises a plan to try to make Ptolemy V, who's the king in Egypt now, his ally. So what he does is he gives his daughter Cleopatra as his wife in 193 BC. So Ptolemy's the king, but he's 15 years old. His daughter Cleopatra is 10. But he thinks, okay, I'm going to give her as the wife. That unites the kingdoms. It kind of gives me control. She's going to serve as a spy on the inside and also influence him. So that's his thinking, to push policy towards him. Ultimately, though, she turns out to be true to Ptolemy, her new husband in the south. And in 180 BC, when Ptolemy died, that makes him 28. I don't know what he died of, but he died at 28. But when he died at that point, she ruled Egypt on behalf of their 6-year-old son. They also had another son and another daughter who was named Cleopatra, too. And she even went so far as to forge an alliance with Rome in order to protect the southern kingdom. So Antiochus III the Great's plan totally failed. She ended up being loyal to her husband, loyal to the southern kingdom, and making this alliance with Rome. So let's read verse 17.
Set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of improvement and reforms. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be true of his name.
So again, when you read that verse, that even looking at the history, some of that seems kind of muddy, but it does fit with him giving the daughter and what happened and flowing through in time. It fits very well, and we'll see what comes after it also fits. And it's very interesting history too. All right, verses 18 and 19 next. So back in Greece, over here, Philip V of Macedon was defeated by Rome. So they had defeated Philip IV of Macedon, and then again Philip V, and that leaves a power vacuum. And Antiochus III ended up taking advantage of that power vacuum and seized many of the coastal islands of Asia Minor. So he took the coasts of Asia Minor in 197 BC, Thracia in 196 BC, but when he crossed into Europe and took Thrace and Greece in 192 BC, the Romans kind of perked up and got involved at that point. In the meeting at Lysimachia with the Roman ambassadors, he was called there to meet with them to try to have some negotiations, so he's called there. And it's quoted, I don't know how accurate this is, but this is what he's quoted as saying: Asia does not concern you, the Romans, and he was not subject to their orders. So apparently he was very enraged at even being called in to judge his actions by the Romans. He felt like that's his place and not theirs. As a result of him refusing to negotiate with them, the Romans subsequently came against him. He was defeated by the Roman general Acilius Glabrio at a place called Thermopylae in 191 BC, and then he was pursued by the general Cornelius Scipio to Magnesium, where he was badly defeated in 190 BC. The Battle of Magnesium is one of the famous history battles, I believe. But there were 30,000 Roman troops versus 70,000 of Antiochus III's, and that's in modern-day Turkey, but they soundly defeated him. As a result of that defeat, in 188 BC, Antiochus III signed the Treaty of Apamea. And what he did at this treaty was he surrendered all of his European and Western Asian territory back to Rome, all of his military elephants, all but 12 warships. He gave them 20 political hostages, including his son, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And so I'm going to put that up here too. So his son, so that's his son, and he's given to Rome as one of the 20 political hostages that they keep. And their hostages weren't the way that we would think of hostages today with a terrorist. They were, I think, kept well. They it was almost like a collateral for maintaining things, that they got to stay there and were treated fairly well, but they were political hostages. In addition to that, though, he had to repay Rome for their war expenses. He had to pay back, and if you think of what war costs, that's a lot of money. It doesn't matter what century you're in. He had to repay them. He was allowed to make that over 12 annual installments. So there's maybe one of your first payment plans. But he had to repay them over the next 12 years. And we're going to see that ultimately has a huge impact on the Greek Empire because of that. He then returned to his own land, and because he's short on money now, he tries to pillage a temple of Zeus to try to gain the needed money from the things that were there. There was an angry mob that killed him because of that, because that was an infraction on their religion in 187 BC. So because of temple robbery, he was actually killed by the people that he ruled over. So let's go ahead now with that history in mind and read verses 18 and 19.
Afterward he shall send his slaves to the coastland, and shall capture them, but a commander shall put an end to them. Indeed, he shall turn against them back upon them. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found.
All right, and again, that sounds very vague, but if you piece what's right before that and what's right after it, I think that's what it's talking about with him. So we'll look at verse 20 now. Seleucus IV, who's the brother of Antiochus III, so that's the third son of Seleucus II. So Seleucus IV becomes the king from 187 to 175 BC. He's crippled, obviously, by this heavy tax burden, and he's got a lack of land and wealth, and yet he's got this huge Roman debt that he has to pay back. During this time frame, because he's now the king, they don't really need Antiochus IV Epiphanes anymore, so he's released from Roman hostage sometime after that. Obviously, it's not as quick as today where you could send an email message and people know right away what's happening. There's a time delay for that to happen, news to get back, him to be released, so that he's not returning immediately. But he's ultimately released from the being a political hostage. And Seleucus' son, what was his name here? Yeah, Demetrius, that's what I thought. Demetrius I Soter is now sent to Rome as a political hostage. Seleucus, the Seleucus IV, who's the king now of the northern kingdom, he sends his prime minister Heliodorus out to collect money. So he goes on this route through trying to impose taxes, collect money any way he can. One of the things that's recorded by the Jews is that he showed up in Jerusalem on the concept that there was great treasure stored in their temple at that time. There wasn't, because they'd been ransacked a lot and there wasn't much there. But he was actually repelled from gaining even the small amount that was actually stored in the temple at that time in their vaults. And then he had similar situations all throughout his journey. So he was repeatedly repelled by the people in all the cities that he went to. On his return, he ends up poisoning Seleucus IV. So the prime minister poisons the king after what he put him through on this tax guidance. It's thought by some people that that Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who's been released from Roman prison, actually aided in the planning of that conspiracy and the poisoning of Seleucus IV. It's not known for sure, but that's theorized because he's on his return from Rome. So with that history, let's read verse 20.
Then shall arise in his place one who shall send him exactly a tribute to the glory of the kingdom. And within 2 days he shall be broken, neither an angry nor in battle.
Okay. So now we jump into Antiochus Epiphanes. So this is verses 21 through 35 that is talking about him. He was king from 175 to 163 BC. There's a lot of interesting things about him that we could cover. A portion of it is in the prophecy, most of it's not. But again, the key part of this prophecy is back here. It's related to Daniel's people and what would occur to them in the latter days. So verse 21, Antiochus IV's given name was actually Mithridates. So the person who was in Roman hostage, was named Mithridates. He assumes the name Antiochus IV Epiphanes when he became king. So because Seleucus had died and he was the king, who should actually be the king of Greece now? Demetrius, right? He's the next one in lineage. But he's still in Roman captivity right now. There's not time for him to be released. So Antiochus takes advantage of that. So he in the process, after he was released, he makes friends with Eumenes II of Pergamum, and I believe also someone named Attalus from that area. Kind of won them over as friends, got support from them, actually goes with an army to Babylon. So he takes an army there, and he appoints Antiochus, so it's Seleucus IV's infant son. So instead of this guy being king, he has an infant son also. And Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who had been named Mithridates, says this infant is now the king. He shows up with an army, says this guy's the king. I'm here to be his regent and kind of help out with him. And that infant's name happened to be Antiochus. And Mithridates takes the name Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And again, it was Epiphanes Theos, I think, which actually meant God manifest. But that's the name that he takes for himself. I think it's interesting that he took the same name as that infant. 5 years later, he has the child killed. And so now he's the king. So let's read verse 21 with that part of the history in mind.
In his place shall rise a contemptible person whose royal majesty has not needed. He shall come in without warning and change by flattery.
So that fits perfectly with how he basically took over as king, and he wasn't in lineage to be the king, but he took over as king without even a battle. So verse 22, in 170 BC, Ptolemy VI Philometor demanded the return of a portion. I don't have the map up here anymore, but he's from the south. He demands a portion of the Syrian province back. Antiochus IV Epiphanes anticipates that war is coming, and so he strikes first. So there's a demand for the land back. He strikes right away in return. He strikes deep into Egypt. He took Ptolemy hostage but didn't kill him, primarily out of concern that Rome's going to get involved. If he kills the king of the south because of Rome's interest in Alexandria and the shipping and trade there, the Rome's going to get involved. So he didn't kill him, but he took him as a hostage. He deposes Onias. Onias is the Jewish high priest, and Jason wants to be the high priest. And so he comes and bribes Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who doesn't really care about the Jewish system. But because Jason is what's known as a Hellenizer, he kind of promotes the Greek style of living and the Greek ways, and he gives Antiochus IV Epiphanes a bribe. Antiochus just deposes Onias, has him killed, and makes Jason the high priest. So let's read verse 22 with that in mind.
Armies shall be utterly swept away before him, and those who be the prince of the covenant.
All right, so the Prince of the Covenant appears to be referring to the Jewish high priest there. All right, so verses 23 and 24 next. He made covenants with a lot of different people in Egypt, so he makes lots of allies throughout Egypt. And by doing that, Antiochus was actually able to take much of Egypt. He makes allies and kind of has the people under his control, even though he hasn't had a battle in that area now. It's something many of his predecessors had tried to do but failed. So he takes over the vast majority of Egypt. He's stopped by the Romans from taking Alexandria, though. It was common practice during that time to distribute the spoils of victory to the troops as kind of their payment and to keep them engaged because they're risking their lives. But it's well documented in multiple sources, including the Maccabees, Polybius in the histories, and Josephus, that he took his plunder and gave it to people in the regions that were being plundered, kind of spread it around to other people so that he could kind of keep them under his control. So he wins them over peaceably that way with kind of getting them under his wing by giving them the spoils from other people that he's taken over. So let's read verses 23 and 24 now.
From the time that the alliance made with him shall act, he shall become strong with his small people. Without warning, he shall come to the richest part of his wrath, and he shall do what neither his father nor his father's father has done. Gathering among his sons spoil and goods, he shall devise plans against strongholds to win a third time.
All right, and then verses 25 and 26, Antiochus brings an army of infantry, cavalry, and an elephant corps, war chariots, and a fleet at sea towards Egypt. Ptolemy VI also brought a very large army, and this is the Sixth Syrian War. I don't have it up, but this is the last of the six Syrian wars. Ptolemy VI, though, of Egypt was undermined by insiders who'd been won over by Antiochus. So there's a lot of people who are really supporting Antiochus because of the way he'd handled things. They're disloyal subjects. Ptolemy apparently had inept personal advisors. The historian Polybius lays the entire blame for what happens here on the advisor Eutychus. But as a result of Ptolemy not having a united front, Egypt fell to Antiochus, and it was only Rome's intervention that stopped a total takeover because the Roman Senate did not want Alexandria to fall out of their influence. So verses 25 and 26.
And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with him, exceedingly great and mighty army, and he shall not stand, his plots shall be divided against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and he shall fall down in slain.
So after that, Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI meet. Antiochus Epiphanes acts like he's showing kindness to Ptolemy. He tells him, hey, I'm going to help you. Let me help you to conquer Egypt on your behalf. That'll kind of get everybody back underneath you, set you up as a sole ruler. Ptolemy pretends to go along with it, but really he's wanting Antiochus to get everybody united so that he can continue to control them and take over rather than being a puppet king under Antiochus. But because they were both negotiating deceitfully, the war doesn't end and continues with no ceasefire. So verse 27.
And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on ruin. They shall speak lies and set tables of no avail. For the end is yet expected with the time of war.
So 169 BC, after the war ended, carrying the spoils of war, Antiochus IV Epiphanes' path home was straight through Palestine. There's an insurrection in progress at that time. This is reported in the Maccabees. Remember, Jason was the one that he had made the high priest. Well, in the meantime, Menelaus came to Antiochus IV Epiphanes with a bribe and said, make me the high priest. It's a bigger bribe. So he Antiochus deposed Jason and makes Menelaus the high priest. So that's what had happened back in Jerusalem in the interim. Well, Jason had incorrectly been told that Antiochus had been killed in the battle in the south. So the news is circulated that Antiochus IV Epiphanes had died. So Jason goes back to Jerusalem, attacks Jerusalem, and tries to kill Menelaus so he can be the high priest again. And Antiochus IV Epiphanes comes through while this insurrection is happening. So because of his traveling through that area, probably also his pride in the victory over Egypt, it gave him a reason to vent on the Jews that he hated and their religion. So he marched straight to Jerusalem, took it by storm, slaughtered everyone they met on the road or in houses, women and children, infants alike. They killed 40,000 people and sold 40,000 more into slavery. Antiochus then looted the temple with the aid of Menelaus, who was the high priest he had appointed. He entered the holy place and carried off the golden utensils, and then returned to his own land. And that's history from Josephus, Polybius, Strabo, and Nicholas of Damascus. So let's read verse 28.
And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land.
All right, so verse 29 and the first phrase of 30, when we read that, depending on your translation, it may say Kittim in the New American Standard and King James Version, Cyprus in the New King James, or Western Coastlands in the NIV. Those are all representative of Roman colonies and or the types of ships that the Romans would be using. So because they want to protect their interests, the Roman Senate sent a letter to Antiochus Epiphanes via Popilius Laenas. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly or not. But they sent a letter telling Antiochus that he was to withdraw his armies from Egypt and from Cyprus or be considered at war with the Roman Empire. So Popilius Laenas met Antiochus at Alexandria when Antiochus returns against Egypt a year later in 168 BC. And interestingly, I had read somewhere in some of the reading, that these two knew each other from the time that Antiochus was actually in Rome. So that doesn't mean they were friends, but they actually knew each other before this time, so it wasn't a random meeting. But Popilius delivers the letter to Antiochus there at Alexandria. Antiochus reads it and replies that he would consider it, and then the event that's famous occurred at that point. When he says he would consider it, Popilius Laenas draws a circle around him in the sand and tells Antiochus for Epiphanes to decide to leave Egypt before he leaves the circle, or face war. So Antiochus sullenly relents to that, and he's defeated without a battle even taking place. And interestingly, and Carl showed me a blown-up image of the coin that I put on your question sheet, he had just added in the last year, he took the coins that they had them re-minted. I guess they didn't use mints then, but however they made the coins. But he added the victorious to his coinage. So after defeating Egypt more than any previous northern king had, he adds bearer of victory to his coins. And then this happens. So it kind of shows the pride he had in what he had just done. So less than a year before that had happened. So let's read verses 29 and the first phrase of verse 30. Okay. So after he's confronted at Alexandria, he returns through Judea. He takes his humiliation and his furor out on the Jews that he hated. He had Apollonius, who was the head of his mercenaries and the chief collector of tribute, go into Jerusalem peaceably. So because they control the area, so they just go in peaceably, nothing happening. And then on the Sabbath, they attacked and started massacring everybody. He made it illegal and punishable by death to follow Judaism. And as such, the phraseology that was just read, those who forsake the Holy Covenant are given preference. He desecrated the temple with a pig sacrifice and poured the juices of that all throughout the temple, placed an idol of Zeus within the temple. That was in 167 BC that the regular sacrifices ceased. They didn't resume for 3 years when the temple was restored in 164. So some of the specifics of his atrocities: he killed mothers who had the babies circumcised, hung the babies in public, and then any of the family and anyone who had circumcised them were also hung in public along with the babies. He slaughtered anyone that was found with a copy of the Scriptures or anyone whose life adhered to them. There's multiple events recorded in the Maccabees. One of them that stood out is that 2 mothers were paraded that had their babies circumcised were paraded around Jerusalem in a wagon while they were holding their babies, and then in front of everybody they took them up to a high point on the wall and threw them down on the inside of the city, so that it was all very public. They tried to make it very public and very gruesome. And that, you can't probably see it well, but that's a tapestry rendition that kind of denotes some of the things that happened. Any copies of the Scriptures that were found were burned. So with that in mind, let's read, go back into the middle of verse 30. So after where it says, therefore he shall be grieved, start there and read verse 30 and 31. Okay. So the abomination of desolation, that's a phrase that we've talked a little bit about before, the abomination that makes desolate. Depending on the translation you have, it may be worded just slightly differently. So Daniel talks about it again here in 1131, clearly referring to this time of Antiochus Epiphanes from 167 to 164 BC. What's that phrase mean? What's abomination? I'm sorry? Yeah, it was the end of temple worship is what the whole phrase is referring to. What's something that's abominable? What's offensive, hated, yeah, just disgusting. So that's what's abomination means. What's desolation? Deserted, empty, useless. So it means the terrible state of being useless, and it's referring to the temple, that it's useless. There's no sacrifices that can be offered. So that's what it's referring to. We'll come back and talk about it more because that phrase or variation of that is used again in chapter 12. All right, so let's turn our attention to verses 32 to 35 now. There were already a lot of the Jewish elite, intellectuals, high society Jews who had espoused the Grecian ways. You can imagine, it's kind of like we're all in love with New York and Paris, and that's kind of the thinking, changes the thinking centers for everybody. That's kind of how it was for the Jewish elite, that Greek culture had impacted them greatly. So a lot of them were not committed religiously, and they supported Antiochus because it's kind of the new culture, new society. So that led to a clear divide between the majority who either supported him or they were fearful of the punishment, and the few who continued to remain faithful, remain loyal to God. Many of those who were loyal to God fled into the wilderness. A priest named Mattathias and his 3 sons, Judas, Jonathan, and Simon, were the well-known Maccabees that we've all heard of. They sparked a religious and ultimately a physical rebellion against the Hellenizers. They were aided by a group called the Hasidim, which means the pious ones, and that was a movement towards the revival of the ancient traditions and fidelity towards God. And interestingly, the Hasidim were the predecessors of the Pharisees. So that's where that whole movement with the Pharisees started, was to return back to God's way in a time that was turning away from it. The Maccabees and their followers became so strong that they began forcing the Jews to obey. So they were being physical with the Jews who weren't being obedient, pushing them physically to obey. And then you had Antiochus IV Epiphanes on the other side, who was persecuting and being cruel to the people who weren't following. But they became so forceful in it that in order to, people felt like it's our best, we're actually safer because the Hasidim and the Maccabees are right here, so they remained faithful to the rules, even though it wasn't because of their loyalty. It's just they felt like my risk is lower if I follow Judaism than if I don't, and because the Greeks aren't here all the time. So there were some who joined what the wording is used in some translations by intrigue, and that's what I think that means, is that they were following along because they felt like they had to, rather than because it was really what they believed. Just as a side point, too, we're given perhaps some of the reason that God allows this to happen. We've talked before about sometimes bad things happen to faithful people. We'll see in verse 35 that he says that that's allowed to refine and purify the faithful. And so there's a way in which it actually strengthens those who remain faithful. So then there's the Maccabean revolt that goes on for several years, and they recaptured the temple. Hanukkah is the celebration of the rededication of the temple to Jewish worship in 164 BC. So the revolt was aimed at the Greeks and at the Jews who had succumbed to Greek religion. So let's read verses 32 to 35. Okay. So we're going to move now into verses 36 through 12:3, and we're obviously not going to get through all of this tonight. Let me pull up the next set of slides here real fast. Okay. So we're moving into lesson 21 on your question sheet now. So I told you on the outline, this is Rome. It doesn't say anything about Rome, does it? It doesn't say anything about changing kingdoms. But did we see that before? Remember what happened back in 11:2 to 3? Who did we change from? Persia to Greece, right? It didn't say anything about that. It's just you could tell by what happened. It didn't fit Persia, but it did fit Alexander the Great. And the same thing here. As you read through the context, the rest of this doesn't really fit Antiochus IV Epiphanes. For instance, you'll see talking about the wealth that he has as you move down later into this section. Antiochus IV Epiphanes actually didn't have that afterwards. He's crippled by some of the difficulty in paying Rome as well. It talks about controlling Egypt. He lost control of Egypt also because of Rome, and so it doesn't fit Antiochus IV Epiphanes, but it does fit Rome. We're also going to see Jesus' reference to this that tells us it's Rome. But again, it changes who it's talking about, but it's not because we're worried about the history of the Gentiles, right? The purpose of this message wasn't to tell us, here's the future of all the Gentiles. It was to tell us about the impact on Daniel's people in the latter days. And so who it is doesn't really matter as much as here's the impact that's going to be had on you. So it's changing to Rome. So let's look at question 2 on your sheet, and this, I think, kind of helps us to understand it. In Matthew 24, when Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, he references Daniel 12, 1 through 11. And he uses Daniel's phrase, the abomination of desolation, to prophesy about the destruction of Jerusalem. So how does that help us to know who Daniel's talking about here as we get into the end of chapter 11 and chapter 12? what did Jesus tell us he was talking about? Yeah, I mean, it couldn't be Antiochus 4 Epiphanies, right? Because that had already happened before Jesus. And so when Jesus says, be aware, he's talking about what Daniel was talking about. It has to be the Romans. So we'll start with there on Wednesday night. We'll try to move through that part of it quickly so we can get to the lesson on behind the curtain. So hopefully we'll wrap everything up then. Thanks, everybody. And just as a side point, if you think, hey, this would be a better way to present this material, let me know. I really struggled with the best way to do this, and maybe this was a bad way, but if you got a better idea, please let me know. Thanks.